Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the first and possibly only episode of Double Feature Review. I'm Libby.
I'm David.
Oh, he did it perfectly. And we're going to talk about two films, a double feature. I wanted to make sure to say up front that one of these films contains a depiction of the aftermath of a suicide, and the other one contains a depiction of an attempted suicide. So if that is not something that is healthy for you to hear or watch right now, maybe save these films and this podcast for a time when you're feeling better. If you are part of my BookTube audience, this may be slightly surprising to you. I'm not dead. I've just moved back to the United States, and that took up a lot of my time. So I haven't really been reading, so I haven't had books to talk about. But I did have time to watch a movie. And I'm married to someone who knows a lot about films.
Movies are great.
Bona fide film expert right there. So we
Exciting.
Are going to talk about two films. David, what are they today?
They are The Children's Hour and Tea and Sympathy.
Yes. Tea and Sympathy from 1956, The Children's Hour from either 1961 or 1962. I've seen both. Children's Hour directed by William Wyler, and Tea and Sympathy directed by Vincent Minnelli. And we also need to talk about the actors up front, because we are pretty guilty of using the actor's name to refer to the character.
Yeah, that's probably going to happen a lot.
So, just to make it absolutely clear, The Children's Hour stars Audrey Hepburn as Karen Wright and Shirley MacLaine as Martha Doby. Tea and Sympathy stars Deborah Carr as Laura Reynolds, John Carr, no relation, they just have identical last names, as Tom Lee, and Leif Erikson, not that Leif Erikson, as Bill Reynolds.
And the way you spell Carr in like Deborah Carr is Kerr.
I assume people already know that because they're film aficionados.
Great, we're all on the same page here. I wouldn't.
So David and I like to sort of pair movies together and sometimes group them into even bigger groups.
Yes.
One day we'll tell you about our nightclub series.
Oh, that's a good one.
We think it's more interesting to watch films together, and it makes each of them more interesting. Two great tastes that taste great together. So we each have separately come up with names for this particular series, and you can sort of think of the series name as if this were a film studies course and you were assigned these two films, what would the syllabus say that the topic for this day was? David, do you want to go first?
No.
I didn't think of one.
I didn't. I was not ready, so no.
I have two. So this is the fake one. It's very tempting to go with homosexuals at a school, but I think I would actually call this series, we really, really wanted to make a movie about gay people, and this is the best we could do. A letter from the mid-century.
Yeah, I mean, I think the title I want to give it is something like 1950s major feature films about gay people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's maybe closer to your second one. And I think it's probably a more interesting way to put that. But
I do think that there are other 1950s and 60s films about gay people that are more famous and possibly more significant than these two, though I cannot currently name any.
I'm sure there are definitely are.
Is Ben-Hur 50s?
Ben-Hur is 1960s. I think it would be classified as later. You know, that's definitely written in a slightly different cultural era.
Okay.
So I don't know what the right term, maybe mid-century, that's a hard term to use. But yeah, I think what's noted about these films is surprisingly early in history, these are films that are actually talking to some extent about gay people in a intelligent way that's not just smearing gay people, but let's actually discuss homosexuality in society. So, you know, I don't know, maybe 1950s films about gay people would be a pretty good title, because I think that's the hook. That's what
because all the other ones that I'm thinking of are actually 60s and 70s.
That's a decent chance of that. You know, there's definitely more.
And some historical context for these films. One of the reasons that I think they pair so well together is that they are both based on Broadway plays of the same name. Tea and Sympathy premiered on Broadway about 5 years before the film was made, and the 3 lead actors were the same from the stage to the film, which means that John Carr was a little too old to be playing an 18-year-old. Until it was established that they were at a high school and he was 18, I definitely thought he was like 22 and they were at a university.
Yeah, I think it was sometimes a little bit easier to do when it was just the 2 leads in a scene together. You can sort of contrast them more. I don't know. It kind of worked in some of the beach scenes. They kind of aged him down, but
they put him in very baggy clothes.
Baggy clothes, the big jackets. So whatever. It's you can go with it. He looks he's a young looking person.
And the Children's Hour was actually originally produced for the stage in the 1930s, and is very loosely inspired by events from 1809. David doesn't know this. You're about to learn something. William Wyler, the director of the Children's Hour, tried to direct it before in the 1930s. He did, quote, get to direct it. The film is called These Three.
Okay.
And they had to change the plot where instead of Martha being accused of being in love with her co-teacher, she is instead accused of being in love with her co-teacher's fiance, a man.
I see.
Which kind of deadens the whole thing. Like, oh no, there is a love triangle. I can't have that at a school.
Yeah, what really made it exciting was the fact that there was a scandal at a school. That's the core of the story.
Oh, and now that I've described the plot, another bit that we have is we're each going to give you a 1-sentence plot introduction. I believe these will be spoiler-free, but this podcast will not be spoiler-free. So we're each going to do a 1-sentence plot introduction. I don't think we can get a full plot summary into 1 sentence. We're each going to give you one for each film. Do you want to go first, or are you going to make me go first again?
I go first. Okay.
Pick either film.
Yeah, for Children's Hour, I would say the plot is accusations of lesbianism among teachers at a girls' boarding school leads to a major scandal that divides a community.
That was very good. And I don't know if I can come up with a better one.
Thank you.
Yours was so good, which means I get to do a cheeky one.
Great.
So I'm going to say my plot synopsis, my plot introduction for Children's Hour is little girls are the worst.
That's what most of the screen time is spent delivering.
There's a meaningful amount of screen time devoted to that. Okay, so I'll go first for Tea and Sympathy, so you can do a fun one. No matter how much time you spend around women in their bathing suits, other teen boys will find a way to think that you're gay. Was that too cheeky?
So I'm supposed to do the fun one, and you're going to do the one
that was very... That's what synopsis. The plot is about.
I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong. Okay. Give me a second. Then.
Yeah.
So I would say it's a classic gay romance where one of the romantic leads is a woman. I don't know if that's very good.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
Okay, I don't know how accurate that is. That's a very that's intended in a very literary way, so I'll leave that up to your intelligent interpretation.
Okay, so now we have not talked about the films at all since we finished watching them. So is there anything you are desperately burning to say now that we get into the meat of it?
Okay, so we watched these films in the order that they were released or the order that they were written?
Because... The order that the Broadway plays premiered in. Okay. Which is not the order that the films were made.
Okay, so we watched the order that they were sort of written in, originally released as plays. They were released as films in the opposite order. Okay, so we watched The Children's Hour first. Okay, so Children's Hour was released as a play in 1934. And Tea and Sympathy was released as a play in 1953. Okay, so then Children's Hour was released as a movie. Oh, so then Tea and Sympathy was released as a movie first.
Yes.
So then Tea and Sympathy was released as a movie in...
56.
And Children's Hour was released as a movie in...
Either 61 or 62. I've had conflicting information.
That's right. It kind of goes back and forth, depending on how you interpret it. Okay. So we watched Children's Hour first, and then we watched Tea and Sympathy.
And one thing that I found interesting, and I think this is the first thing that made me want to talk to you about these, because you're a smart, filmsy person, is, to me, Children's Hour felt like an older movie.
Okay, I think that's
Does
true.
that are you picking up what I'm putting
So,
down?
I mean, I think aesthetically and culturally, you're right
Mhm.
that Children's Hour is distinctly designed to be a sort of classic style film, and that Tea for Sympathy is very much almost.
It's Tea and Sympathy, but I do like the title of Tea for Sympathy.
There's happens.
I think Tea and Sympathy is a bad title.
I can't help but think of the song "Tea for Two," and they're kind of in the same era, if not exactly the same aesthetic. So if they're a bit fused for me, I'll admit it. So Tea and Sympathy is a kind of almost a hippie or Aquarian almost movie. It's leaning as hard in that direction as it kind of knows how to do. Especially to get, well, I'm sure we'll discuss later, the visuals, especially towards the end of the movie, are very vibrant and sort of powerful in that way. So I definitely think that's true. And I think it's especially carried out, if you want to talk at all about the cinematography, and kind of the headline that we've left outside of the social sign, is that Tea and Sympathy, the earlier film, is made in color.
Yes.
At a time when there were color movies, but at a, something of a technical, again, does use color quite meaningfully in certain parts of the movie. Whereas The Children's Hour, a later film, was shot in black and white. We might even say at a time where that was slightly out of fashion, or becoming out of fashion. Again, I think to evoke a more classic feeling, and because I think what made that movie nice to look at, to complement it, is it's really careful and meaningful use of light. And it's really pretty, and it has nice photography, and I think they use light and shadow very effectively to tell the story, which is more in that style.
And one thing you said when we were watching Children's Hour, was that you felt it was overscored. It was nominated for an Oscar for Best Score. I felt like there was a really distinct shift, a little bit more than a third of the way through Children's Hour, in the filmmaking style. So I almost I had to check at a certain point to see if this film had actually been directed by Alfred Hitchcock, because you get some very Hitchcockian music and what I think of as Hitchcockian cinematography, although possibly I just mean mid-century thriller cinematography.
It does start to take on a little bit more of a thriller style that it didn't have, and in either at the beginning or at the end.
Now, I feel like just at the beginning it felt honestly less good. I was like, this is kind of schmaltzy. So there's a scene where I guess we have to tell you a little bit more of the plot if you haven't seen it. Although this podcast is meant to be equally accessible to people who have seen the films or haven't, or have only seen one of the films. If you've only seen The Children's Hour, which is probably the one you've seen out of these two, we encourage you to also watch Tea and Sympathy. So Mary, who is a very nasty little girl, who is trying to spread this rumor that her teachers are gay, and it is ambiguous to me as to whether she actually understands what she's implying.
Yeah, I feel like she has to. And that is one of the things that is almost a plot hole about the movie, and it's sort of there so much at the very beginning, which is this girl is very culturally and sexually aware. She really knows how to really push people's buttons and really get them very specifically concerned about lesbianism in a way that seems slightly abnormal.
Well, I am remembering there's a fairly short scene when we see the girls about to go to bed where she's reading a book and another girl is reading over her shoulder. They're like reading it together. And Mary says, "I've already finished the page, hurry up." And the other little girl reading with her says, "Wow, double wow." And I think we are meant to understand that she's reading a salacious book.
Yes.
And that could be a salacious book about lesbians.
Yeah.
So in the first third of the movie, you get this very dramatic, volume too high suspense music, while Mary is whispering in her grandmother's ear about the unnatural sounds and goings on that are happening in her school. And she quite conspicuously at one point says, "I can't tell you, I have to whisper it." And her grandmother says, "Why?" And she says, "I just have to." And the answer to that question is, because we're in a film and the Hays Code says we can't. So the word unnatural is used to describe the way Martha feels about Karen, or the relationship between Karen and Martha. And I think people watching, everyone would understand what that means. But they are very hesitant to say lesbian
Sure.
lover, they were kissing, anything like that. So presumably all that happens when Mary is whispering in her grandmother's ear. And so then I was really surprised when we got to, I think, sort of 2 scenes later, when after the grandmother has pulled her granddaughter out of school and told all the other parents, and all of those children have been pulled out of the school. The teachers go to confront her, and Audrey Hepburn's character is maybe engaged in a relationship with this grandmother's nephew, cousin. Mary, the mean little girl, and Joe, Audrey Hepburn's fiance, are cousins. And she very directly says, they said that Martha and I are lovers. And I was like, oh, I thought we were going to spend the whole film not actually saying this, because we have this scene with the whispering, and then we have the teachers asking all the parents why they're taking their kids out of school, and they say, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to talk about it. And when the only way they find out is because Audrey Hepburn takes one of the parents outside, and we see from Shirley MacLaine's perspective the two of them talking.
Right.
But we don't actually hear anything that they say.
Yes.
So, to me, I'm giving the director credit by assuming that was like a bait and switch. They were trying to make it seem more scandalous, and then they were like, actually, this isn't that salacious, this is serious, we're actually ruining people's lives. And then moving to the very end with Martha coming out saying that she actually is in love with Karen, where the music gets a lot more subtle, and it seems like we're taking this film more seriously, which kind of reminds me of the film Philadelphia, which basically just did this in the marketing. So if you are millennial or older, you have probably at least seen the poster for the movie Philadelphia, starring Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington. But if you haven't seen it, you probably don't know that Tom Hanks has AIDS, and that's what the movie is about. Because they really didn't market it about that at all. So I think they were, with what Wyler was trying to do was make you think you were going to get something scandalous, and then actually get something more human. And maybe he didn't fully succeed, but I think that's what he was going for, and made me sort of forgive some of the earlier directorial choices. Yeah.
So, I remember you correctly did say that I mentioned that I felt like the film was overscored at times. And I think that you're right that it isn't to say the film had bad music. I almost don't want to say that, because I actually think a lot of the music was good. And I thought it was well written. And I think, like a lot of good Hitchcock films from that same time, you do see, especially directors in this time, putting even more emphasis on having not just nice sounding and evocative music, but interesting music that actually is really engaging with what you're seeing on screen. I just think it was maybe sometimes a little heavy-handed, but I understand why it was nominated, because I actually think it was mostly nice music and forward-thinking music, kind of in its own way. So that was nice. But yeah, maybe a little less could have been good. And I think you're sort of putting it in the right way, and I might actually go even further when you said that you're sort of trying to give the director credit here. I think my interpretation might even be more generous, because although still not totally to the whole situation, in that I think initially the director is trying to maybe sort of lull you into a sense of security, not so much that it's going to be some salacious, scandal-oriented film, as much as, oh, but we're not really going to talk about it. It's not going to get too real. Don't worry, don't leave the theater. And again, the big twist at the end, finding a twist to some extent, finding out that the accusations of lesbianism maybe do have some element of truth behind it that we must all discover along the way. That is not really, you don't think that's coming necessarily when you're watching the movie. I think that's fair to say that's supposed to be a surprise. And so again, I think not putting that information at the beginning is kind of an attempt to force the audience to sympathize with the characters and prevent the audience from getting too squirmy and feeling like they're oh, this movie isn't for me. I'm not ready to talk about these things.
Until it's too late.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, and I think he does this very effectively, because there is actually a moment where it's pretty clear that Shirley MacLaine is in love with Audrey Hepburn in the second scene of the film. She says, I remember the first time I saw you, da-da-da-da, I thought, what a pretty girl.
Mm-hmm.
And then I completely forgot that this
Yeah.
moment had happened, and I was like, oh, it's right there. I
Yeah.
completely forgot that this moment had happened until the
Sure.
end when she says, actually, I am in love with you.
Yes. You know, I think, it's there in the back of your mind, but like, but the whole point is that it's not true.
Mhm.
And, I think it's actually a pretty, to some extent, I think the reason we're having these discussions of these movies they are interesting pieces of social justice advocacy. These are people actually trying to advance conversation about homophobia forward pretty actively. Not necessarily always successfully, but pretty actively. And so, I think he's trying to lead to those conversations inside of the groups of people watching the movie instead of saying, well, I guess it wasn't so bad because it wasn't true. And, well, it was true. Well, maybe it's not so bad after all. It's a bit ham-fisted in that way. I think also, the reason why it's slightly tricky is I think another part of the factor is it's kind of a censorship dodging or management strategy. And that's another big thing that's a big theme of these films is you have to watch them with the fact in mind that they're in a really hostile censorship environment. And that affects the way the movies are made.
These are not the scripts that the directors wanted to be working with.
And so, I think part of it is that it's sort of in the same way he's trying to sort of negotiate the audience to keep watching the movie, he's trying to negotiate the censors by saying, look, we're not bringing in the heavy-handed content in the beginning and we're just sitting in it the whole time. We're introducing it gradually for what that's worth. I would also, to harken back to the important warning that you gave at the beginning of the podcast, I think this is really worth noting towards what happens at the end of the children's hour, where Shirley MacLaine kills herself, where, that's obviously a really heavy-handed leaning into the trope of kill your gays. It's
bury your gays.
Bury your gays. It's not very that congruous with the rest of the story. And I think it's pretty clear, even to someone watching at that time, that that's not really what's supposed to be happening in the story.
The quote canon ending. She does also kill herself in the play. She shoots herself rather than hanging herself. But the last shot that we see of Shirley MacLaine alive, we don't see her dead body. But so the last shot we see of her character, she's looking out of a window at Karen and like smiling. And I think it's obvious that this isn't really the canon ending. Because it's so easy to substitute in a different ending. If I was going to direct this play today, I would have, there's a scene after Martha has come out, and the grandmother has discovered that Mary's grandmother has discovered that Mary was lying and comes to apologize and says, I'm going to have the libel suit that you brought against me reversed. So you will have, the judge will say that I was incorrect and you'll get the full payment and I'll also give you any other money. Karen goes to Martha and says, I'm going to leave. I want to start a new life and I want you to come with me. I think you could just end it there. The addition that I would write is I'd have Martha say something like, no, I don't want to ruin your life. And then Karen can say, Martha, you're my best friend. And wherever I go, I want to be with you. And also, we are the only two people in the world who have legal evidence that we are not lesbians now. Big smiles at each other. Curtain. That's my ending for the children's hour.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I think that ending would get a great response. I think it'd be a crowd pleaser. That sounds like a crowd pleaser.
Hire me.
No, I think it's one thing that I thought was actually kind of surprisingly compelling about the children's hour that wasn't about the scandalous element or the social justice part was there was kind of an interesting and I thought quite well told kind of love triangle story that ended up emerging out of all of it, where we had Audrey Hepburn's character being really passionate about her relationship with Joe, played by a well-known actor.
James Gardner?
James
Gardner. I can't remember his first name.
Who's been in a lot of good movies.
He had actually been blacklisted, and this was his first movie back in a long time.
First movie back.
Yeah. Wyler was like, hey, this film's going to be controversial. Might as well make it doubly controversial. Also, you know more about this period of filmmaking, so let me know if this seems correct. I'm wondering, there were definitely some editing problems. I blame this on insufficient coverage. I think there were a couple times where they only shot things from one angle and they took multiple takes. So if they wanted half of one take and half of another, they didn't have anything to cut to. I'm wondering if Weiler didn't give this movie his all because he knew that he wasn't going to get an Oscar for it. Because quite notably, this movie doesn't have any major Oscar nominations. No Best Actor, no Director. It got It got nominated for cinematography, score, art direction, and costumes.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, it's definitely true that there is a cap, a ceiling on where this film can go, and that's affecting things. I think also, frankly, you're totally fair to highlight there's some actual just editing errors in this movie where things are not done right. I think part of it is that just this is maybe at a slightly older era where we haven't really fully accepted the idea that you need to go into the editing room and make the best movie you have with the footage you have, even if it doesn't exactly match what your plan was. Maybe there's some sort of overly orthodox approach here, but there's just some errors. I don't know. The Academy side is tricky. This is, of course, not the era when the Academy Awards are taken the most seriously.
Okay.
That's maybe happening maybe a little bit later, although, they're definitely a big deal. It's something more on the marketing side, I guess, in the mid-century, but that's, there's some of both. Still a little bit of marketing now. So, yeah, I think, I think that Audrey Hepburn is not necessarily phoning in her performance. I think she's doing a good job. But I don't know that everyone is fully bringing everything they can to this film. It's probably a low-budget film for whatever that means in the system at the time. I'll say who I thought did a actually very effective job in the movie with not necessarily the best writing is the grandmother character, who I don't actually know the name of the character or the actress.
Mrs. Tilford. And
yes.
The actress is, I know that this was her last performance. Faye Bainter.
Yeah.
Oh, and she actually did get a nomination for best supporting actress.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think that was actually quite deserved. It's a villain. It's an unsympathetic character, and it's often a character who doesn't have that much to say, and it's just sort of bringing a shocked reaction or a sharp.
I think
words.
It's really interesting that you think she's the villain.
I think that she is. On the bad guys team, for most of the movie. She comes around at the end.
I think that she is on the bad guys team, but that's because she's been lied to and she doesn't want to disbelieve her granddaughter. I think honestly the boldest part of this movie is not the lesbianism, but the fact that they fully make a child the villain.
Yeah, that's something I felt like, you talked about how the maybe the first half or the first third of the movie is a little bit different than some of the other the rest of the movie. I felt like that first half was actually reminded me of a lot of sort of classic 30s and 40s European movies that do feature these villain child characters. And she's borderline impish. She's a devilish figure in the film. Yep. And I think she is actually a great film villain. Let's add her to the great film villains list because she is so scary and, so consumed with all this. But I frankly felt like she was actually kind of still a personal character. You saw this young person somewhere between spoiled and neglected, going through these really intense emotions and has just found themselves in a life where they're committed to doing evil things if that's what it takes to get ahead. And, they're
I'm not
really
totally
stuck.
Sure that spoiled and neglected is appropriate because there were multiple occasions where she lies a lot, but she's not very good at lying, and they're generally pretty obvious. Unfortunately, they're only obvious to our heroes, and they are really understanding with her. Any time she gets caught in a lie, the adults around her say, "Look, it's normal to lie. I've told lies. We won't be mad at you if you confess now." And she doubles down every single time.
Yeah, well, I think this is also interesting related to what you said before about is the grandmother really a villain? Because there is this at the beginning of the movie, or when the accusations first come out, which is a little bit into the movie. They sort of portray the grandmother as just sort of confused and bamboozled by the whole thing. But I actually kind of liked how they saw the grandmother had suspicions from the beginning, and I felt like the high arc point of the film is this sort of relatively long confrontation scene in the kind of the family hall and
all the grandmother's house.
At the grandmother's house, and all the main characters are there, and they they finally confront each other and try to settle all the scores. And you can see that the grandmother is really concerned about the accusations, but is also increasingly realizing that she's kind of in over her head, and her family's reputation is at stake, and now the financial reputation of the school is at stake, and she's already taken action. And so I think what does make her a villain, in my eyes, for the middle part of the movie, is that she's in this period where she's like, okay, I'm not 100% sure that all the things are true, but I'm not going back now. I got to do what it takes to pull this through. And so she then sort of pulls out of that at the end. But there is this central part, and that's why I think that middle scene is the most compelling part of the movie. That's the part that I'd really sit down and enjoy.
I believe that's in the entirety of Act 2.
Basically.
So on stage... Act 1 is the schoolhouse. Act 2 is the grandmother's house. Act 3 is back to the schoolhouse.
Yeah. So, and this is the movie is what it is. I think the last part is maybe for a couple of reasons. I think it could have been shorter, frankly. I think it's maybe more of a 90-minute movie or whatever than the 2-hour movie that it was. I think maybe there's some censorship-friendly content added in there. But it's really the action of the characters when they're negotiating all these things that is the most compelling. The follow-up part where we're, just sort of giving them some time to express their emotions for what's happening, that part's a bit slower. But then, of course, we come to our big twist where things heat up again.
Let's see. If I was going to direct this now, one thing I might change is it seems pretty clear that Mrs. Tilford, the grandmother, is really grossed out by the idea of two women having sex with each other, and that's what she's trying to deal with. And so, we could treat her as the villain because she's like, I don't like lesbians. Lesbians can't run a school.
Is she the one that says, maybe if it's their own private activities, I don't really care, but when children are involved? Okay, it may not have been her. Someone does say that in the film.
That might be Martha's aunt.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that Mary's accusation is actually a problem, because if you are running a school for children, you shouldn't be noisily having sex. And Mary's accusation, we kind
of get into it at a certain point.
They are graphically, they are noisily having sex.
That's right.
And honestly, it doesn't matter what the genders are at that point. That's a problem. So, are you ready to move on to Tea and Sympathy, or did you have anything else for the Children's Hour?
Well, yeah, let's talk about Tea and Sympathy.
Okay. So the Children's Hour is cleaves pretty closely to the stage play. They tightened up a little bit of the dialogue, and also they had more opportunities to change locations, which they take advantage of. But those are the primary changes. The film Tea and Sympathy is meaningfully different from the play Tea and Sympathy. First of all, they added a framing device, which we consider to be not canon, which takes place 10 years after the fact. And at the end, our heroine reveals that she was bad and she shouldn't have done what the entirety of the film is dedicated to demonstrating that she should have done.
I think we might introduce the plot on this one a bit.
Yeah. I think it's also less likely people have seen it. So do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So yeah, it's a story about a boy at a college? Is that right? Is he at university, at a high school?
It is a boarding school.
A boarding school.
In the play, it is described as being for 13 to 19-year-olds.
Yeah.
We only ever see kids who look like they're 17 and older.
Yeah. And
so I think they may at one point refer to it as a prep school.
Yeah, this may not be an educational institution that fits as well in America now as it used to.
I mean, in the 50s, they have prep schools, which were like, you do your first 2 years of high school at a normal high school and then go to a boarding school for more advanced college preparation.
Existed. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know.
I know that's closer to the British model.
So it's it's an institution that's somewhere in between high school a university, and a summer camp.
Mhm.
It's kind of got elements of all of those
Mhm.
things, but it's a boarding school for teenage boys. And there's a student here who, from the beginning of the film, is clear he's effeminate. He likes girly stuff, and he's kind of seems like he's might be gay, or he's just very effeminate, and that's his deal. And I think, the film sort of gives us a little bit of information in the beginning that the school is kind of find a somewhat happy balance with this, and like it's not considered that big of a deal.
He gets bullied a bit, and he doesn't really have any friends aside from his roommate, who
happy balance might not be the right
his
term.
Friend. But at least homeostasis.
That's right. But then the boy's father, who they have a strained relationship, arrives, and he kind of makes clear to the headmaster of the school.
It's not the headmaster. It's the guy who he's a teacher, and he's in charge of the dorm that Tom is living in.
His head teacher, maybe, or he's not a teacher. It's not whatever.
It's like his RA, but an adult.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
I think the official term is housemaster
/ camp counselor. Thank you. His housemaster. That things need to improve. He can tell that the other boys are making fun of Tom, even though Tom is a very successful tennis athlete and appears to be doing well and kind of moving up the ladder in the school and getting into clubs and stuff. He finds out that Tom is going to be appearing as a female character in an all-male cast of a 17th century play, but he kind of gets the feeling that Tom is not trying to lean away from feminine things, and he wants the headmaster to fix it. And so
housemaster. The headmaster does not appear in this film.
The housemaster tries to sort of put some pressure on the boy Tom, and
you've gotten really far into this plot synopsis without mentioning the other main character.
That's true. The other main character is the housemaster's wife, played by Deborah Carr. What's the character's name?
Laura Reynolds.
And Laura Reynolds. And Laura is sympathetic to Tom and really likes him. He seems like a nice person to her, and maybe more intelligent and engaged than some of his peers. They hang out. They're friends.
Yeah. She is supposed to hang out with the boys. She's sort of the mom. In the way the dormitories work is, it looks like there's maybe 6 to 10 boys in a building, and they live on the upper floors, and on the ground floor is at a home for the housemaster and his wife, and she invites them in for tea and sympathy.
That's the title of the movie.
Sort of is there to be a mom when they need it.
That's right. So she forms a friendship with Tom, and as this pressure from Tom's father and from the housemaster, her husband, starts to really mess up Tom's life, she sort of tries to defend him and is pushed away by the other adults, saying, "Look, we need to bully this boy because he might be gay, and we need to make him feel really ashamed about that, and that would be a good idea, so get out of the way." So then, Tom goes through some of his own troubles, and that's kind of what the core of the movie is about. Then, though, in the second half of the movie, Deborah Carr, Laura, and Tom begin to establish their own relationship. Their friendship from the beginning, again, because Tom is maybe considered not to be that interested in women. That's sort of part of the undercurrent of the film. From the beginning, they're very close friends. And Laura really decides that she is in love with Tom. And she tells her husband she's in love with Tom.
She never says I'm in love with Tom.
Oh, well, she doesn't quite put it in those words.
I think it's really ambiguous as to whether they, quote, are in love with each other.
Oh,
or
sure. Maybe that's not the right word. But
they like each other a lot and think it's a good idea for them to have sex.
That's right. So then at the end of the film, which is really a really well shot sequence, and I think this is an early color film. They were trying to show how powerful and evocative they could be with color, and it's really beautiful. And it's really I understand that it's different than the play. Yeah.
So the play, pretty much all of the scenes are like inside in a. I think the original set was like Laura's parlor and then Tom's room up above. And I think they managed to get all of the scenes into just one of those two locations. In the film, we move out into a forest for the final sequence, and there's light it appears to be evening time, or maybe it's just really dense forest, so it's difficult for the light to come through. And if I was going to direct this on stage, I would do a rotating set, and so I'd have most of the locations on stage the whole time and be like buildings, and then in the final sequence I would pull them all apart off stage and clear to this like natural scene, because I think we need to get out of buildings.
Yeah, so the ending is just really powerful shot. It's sort of a classic sylvan glade, like from a 40s fantasy film or something, and it's just powerful and immersive, and Tom and Laura consummate their relationship. So, then there's some other stuff that happens but let's just skip anything that happens that doesn't matter.
Then there's the non-canon tacked on ending where Laura says, it was bad for me to have sex with you because you shouldn't cheat on your husband. Yes. So part of the Hays Code was if you cheat on your spouse, you can't be shown to be happy. But we ignore that.
So, that's obviously not part of the real story. Surprisingly layered, I would say, again, for the time, story about homosexuality. And I think part of what ties these films together in a way that's, I think there are different interpretations, is that they both feature these late film romantic plot twists, where it turns out the whole thing about how we all knew who everyone's orientation and what they really liked was, at the end, turns out we didn't actually know. And they felt differently, and we never quite asked them how they felt about it, and then they finally had a chance to express, and now we actually know, and that's the end of the movie. And I think this is really powerful. I guess, to go straight for the meat of the subject, I guess we're supposed to think that Tom is bisexual, maybe?
Yeah, or, again, I don't think in the 50s they will... Maybe they have that concept?
He's just really effeminate. It's not clear. Maybe he's not always interested in women. He's very interested in Laura. But again, I think what makes the film really good, and I want to hear your thoughts too, is that they sort of leave it saying, it doesn't really matter. These people wanted to do these things, and they did it, and then they wanted to do something else later, and they did that thing. And I think that expression of individuality, of choice, is really powerful, especially for a film of that time.
I think I agree with you. The main part of the film, what the film wants you to take away is, what is Tom's sexuality? I don't know, but he is definitely in love with Laura.
Yeah. Like The Children's Hour, I think maybe the most compelling part of the film, even though it does have some interesting technical things and it's really interesting politically, but the most interesting part is that it has an interesting love triangle, and it really explores that substantively. And we have Laura and the relationship with her husband, the housemaster.
His name is Bill.
And I believe he is played by, we mentioned, an actor named Leif Erikson, so it's nice to have him around for sure.
Quite old for the part.
Yes, of course.
It's over 1,000.
So their relationship is sort of falling apart. It's maybe more of a classic 50s style husband isn't listening to wife romance.
One thing that they were able to do with the film that they couldn't do on stage is one of the scenes takes place in their bedroom, and they're quite obviously in twin beds.
Yes, and it's actually mentioned that they don't touch anymore.
They don't, quote, touch anymore.
It comes up. It's a concern for Deborah or Laura.
One thing that I think it came out more when they take away the explicit references to Tom being homosexual, and with the increased numbers of sets that they can use, of locations that they can use, is that the film, much more than the play, epitomizes the expression, being straight is really gay. Being straight is actually really gay. Because to me, as a 21st century bisexual woman, Tom definitely seems like the straightest boy on this campus.
Yeah, it's so true.
So there's an initial scene where Laura and some other housemaster's wives are sewing, and Tom shows up to say hi. And he does some sewing with them, and other boys see this and they're like, oh my God, this boy is sewing. That's a woman thing. He's not manly. And that's just in Laura's parlor. In the film, they move that to the beach. Mm-hmm. So now all the faculty wives are in their bathing suits, and Tom goes and hangs out with them. And the other boys are all playing volleyball and like wrestling with each other. There's a lot of touching going on.
Yeah. I think this is, again, I think maybe it'd be fair to say an intentional part of the film.
Mhm.
It's kind of hinted at again. It's almost too
Yeah.
dark to discuss it in too much detail, but there's this some sort of big camp tradition that happens
Mhm.
every year. The film reminded me a little bit of the film The Wicker Man, and this is the part especially where there's a big bonfire,
Mhm.
and then all the boys come together, and all the older boys tear off all the clothes of the younger boys,
Yeah.
you know, for fun, as a fun gag.
The classic pajama fight.
And the pajama stripping fight.
Yeah.
And Tom is like, I don't really feel comfortable doing this. I don't really want to participate for a variety of reasons. But, you know, that's not some... I don't exactly know what to say about that, but I don't normally... I think a 21st century person would see that very differently than someone at that time. That is a big factor. And I think maybe that's kind of being hinted at intentionally.
And a third instance, Bill doesn't want to have sex with his wife anymore. Nothing straighter than not having sex with women.
Yeah. And, you know, I think part of the tricky political part of the movie...
This will be a pause while we let the cat into the room.
For the cat.
Her contribution is that there was not enough kitty content in either of these films, though she did like the MGM lion that opened each of them. These are both MGM productions, as it feels like every Golden Age film is.
True. Part of what makes the film a little tricky politically is that part of Laura's defense of Tom is pointing out that he's not definitely gay in a way that is not totally sympathetic to gay people. But perhaps understandable at a time. Something, again, is a factor in the children's hour where, you know, them saying part of the film being, we are not gay. That would be questionable, you know. Obviously, that's the historical context that this film was being made in. I don't think that's a criticism of the film, but it is a fact.
And sort of the one way that I think children's hour is more progressive than Tea and Sympathy, and does demonstrate itself to be the later film, is that I really get the feeling from Tea and Sympathy that Lillian Hellman wrote the play to the Children's Hour. Robert Anderson wrote the play for Tea and Sympathy. I actually don't know if Robert Anderson was queer. Although Vincent Minnelli, married to Judy Garland, the director of the film...
also directed films like Ben-Hur and other very successful films.
Does not seem to have been gay, but was quite feminine and was made fun of for being feminine. So I think you saw a lot of himself in Tom. I feel like all of these people wanted to make a movie saying, you shouldn't bully gay people. Right. That's me. And the only way they could do it was to say, you shouldn't bully gay people because they might be straight.
Yes.
Guys, they might be straight.
Right.
And then you'd have bullied a straight person.
Yes.
That's no good. But with the Children's Hour, they Act 1, you shouldn't bully gay people. Act 2, because they might be straight. Act 3, but also they might be gay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, that's, again, a fact of the culture. And both films are clearly trying to slip in, to use the right term, stuff about, you know, and if they were gay, maybe that wouldn't be so bad, right, everyone? But, you know, they're playing ball. They're going with the flow. I think it's true that the movies would certainly not have been made, but that's not true. But obviously that's really complicated. I wanted to highlight something that you mentioned earlier, which is about Tea and Sympathy's use of outside shots. I talked about it before. It begins with one of the nicer sequences of the film, which is kind of a nice beach scene, a little oddly shot, but still really nice looking. And its use of location, which obviously really differs from the play, I thought was really good. You know, the closing sequence at the end is you know, exciting to look at and really evocative. I was also really impressed with the tennis sequence, which is there in the middle of the film.
And which wasn't on stage.
Yeah, which does a great job of setting up the film in a lot of ways. You know, this is where Tom, the student's father, comes in, and he sees Tom just dominating in this tennis game for the most part. And the other boys still aren't impressed with him. And that's what makes him really sort of decide that something has to change.
Because he cuts and chops, which David informed me means playing tennis like a girl.
That is, that in this film,
yes,
the students make fun of Tom by saying he cuts and chops like a girl. Just to clarify, yes, that does mean someone who's, you know, playing a more strategic instead of power-oriented style of tennis. I'll let you interpret that on your own. But yeah, the tennis sequence is really well shot. It has mix of action and dialogue in a way where the dialogue is sort of interacting with the tennis that you're seeing. It's kind of cool looking action shots, and I really liked how they used these really open, broad color spaces, which they kind of had to do to, I guess, maybe to make the cameras work. But it was really powerful and really engaging.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, the Children's Hour doesn't really ever step outside of the filmed play aesthetic.
It doesn't take advantages of its filmic nature.
Yeah, and I think, I think what they do is they sort of have, really nice, in Children's Hour, close-up shots and carefully selected cinematography like Alfred Hitchcock or like Ingrid Bergman, Ingmar Bergman, excuse me. Whereas the Tea and Sympathy, makes it a more watchable movie.
Mm-hmm.
I had a weird...
Before we move on, I did want to mention in the tennis sequence.
Yes.
That's the first shot we get of Tom's dad, Herb, watching him play tennis. And he's like excited about watching his son play tennis.
Yeah.
And then another man runs up who seems to not know that Tom is his son. And says, like, let's go watch the baseball game. I don't want to watch this, like, girly tennis player.
Yeah.
And Herb gets bullied into leaving.
Yes.
So I think, and we also see this with Bill, the housemaster, that, like, they actually are sensitive sweetie pies who have absolutely crushed that part of themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think, that is kind of a nicely picked up theme in the movie. There's kind of an interesting part in the middle when Tom and his best friend and roommate are arguing about the difficulties of the situation, or maybe when he's talking to Laura, and they say, oh, so, Tom's friend isn't going to get bullied because he's an athlete, maybe, or whatever. And it sort of slips you by that Tom is actually a really successful athlete. Yeah. So Tom is actually very capable physically and otherwise. He's a mature and level-headed person. He's succeeding, and he's actually getting along great with everyone. No one really has a problem with Tom. They're just living in a homophobic society, and they don't necessarily care about it.
And they also talk about in the film that, like, any culture that has such rigid ideas which are going to box people in needs a scapegoat. So they've just sort of picked Tom to, pour all of their self-hatred out into.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I found really interesting about Tea and Sympathy in the first half is that it does present it in this pretty effective, almost academic, anthropological way. I was thinking in the first half as I was watching the movie, I was like, wow, if you wanted to show... this is like a documentary that you would show to people about a society that is homophobic. You see, this is how homophobic wheel works. If one of the boys does less feminine things, the other boys will gather around and make fun of them. Isn't that interesting? Yes, more feminine things. The other boys will make fun of him. That is how the society works. And I think Laura actually calls us out sort of in the second half of the movie, and she says, oh, what is this, some sort of tribal thing? And so, the film does... I think kind of a good job of showing just how odd homophobia really is and how unnecessary it is. And I think, I do know people who are homophobic. And when I was watching Tea and Sympathy, I remember thinking a few times, this would be a good movie to watch with these homophobic people. Because it's not the most aggressively sympathetic to gay people. It's not necessarily about that.
There are no gay characters in the film.
But it sort of forces you to think about homophobia in a meaningful and reasonable way. It does challenge you about it. And so while I don't, again, think comes across as great advocacy in modern times, I can understand some of the ideology behind how it was made from that sense.
And if you feel like people who are still in the 50s in terms of the sexual progress, this is maybe the movie for them.
Yeah. I'll tell you whose performance I would actually highlight, and it's a character that we haven't talked about too much, is the character Ellie in Tea and Sympathy.
I'm about to blow your mind.
Okay, I'm ready.
In the original play,
all right,
Ellie is not a character.
Oh.
The entire scene where so Tom, his friend, his roommate Al, in sort of a last ditch effort to help him, says, "Why don't you go have sex with the cafe waitress who apparently has sex with all the, that's where Ellie's house is where you go to have sex if you're at this school." So Tom makes a date with Ellie, because Ellie will gossip about this the next day, and then everyone will hear that he's had sex with Ellie and not think that he's not gay. So he goes and tries to have sex with her, is extremely awkward about it, and really doesn't like touching her or kissing her or anything. And then she figures out that he gets called Sister Boy, and she laughs at him, and that's what prompts him to try to kill himself. In the original Broadway play, I think it's because they didn't have the set for Ellie's house. So that scene is only referred to. Laura overhears Tom making a date with Ellie on the phone, so she just hears his side of the conversation. She tries to prevent him from leaving and going on this date. And then after the scene where she tries to stop him from leaving, the next scene is her husband coming in the next morning and saying Tom's being expelled from the school because he kicked up a ruckus at Ellie's house.
Yeah, I thought the character of Ellie was a really interesting addition and really made the film a lot more compelling. You know, she's initially I think she's a really interesting character because her theme is that she's really never treated fairly. Mm-hmm. From the beginning of the movie, all we see is boys harassing her and her being ignored and mistreated by her boss or coworkers at work. And the film almost doesn't treat her fairly. You know, it sort of uses her as this throwaway kind of dark gag character.
And they really spend a lot of time in the scene at her house showing how gross she is.
Yeah, so I found her really compelling as this sort of character who is always behind. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's not exactly down on her luck, but is just never really treated fairly by anybody. Always is sort of starting from the back. And is being sort of dismissed as by everyone around her. Mm-hmm. But, you know, she is just trying to make the best of the situation that she can. And so this boy, Tom, calls her and she agrees to go on a date with him because she wants to go on a date. And she tries to make him have a nice time and be pleasant with him. And, you know, he just ends up going crazy and ruining her night and scaring her and everything else. And I thought Norma Crane did a really good job. Mm-hmm. I thought it was a really carefully and like deliberately, intentionally acted role. Mm-hmm. She's great in Fiddler on the Roof too. Mm-hmm. And she actually really reminded me somewhat in looks and also in style of Sharon Stone, the modern actress or more recent actress. I could see Sharon Stone playing that role very excellently in a remake for what that's worth. Yeah,
and I think that this may also be a Hays Code thing. Ellie has lots of extramarital sex. She's where you go, and also with teenagers, which seems to not really be something that people are concerned about, although they do make it very clear that it is Tom's 18th birthday on the day that he has sex with Laura.
Yes.
Everyone, he's 18.
Yes.
Although he was not the night before when he went over to Ellie's, so that's why they weren't allowed to have sex.
It all checks out.
So because she is sexually promiscuous, she's not allowed to be portrayed sympathetically.
Yes, exactly.
And I think if the movie were made today, you could have had a more sympathetic portrayal of Ellie.
Yeah, I liked how...
Because she sort of seems like someone who would naturally be sympathetic to Tom, because she's like, yeah, the boys at your school are really gross and mean.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the film she does sort of laugh at Tom, but she's not laughing at him for being gay. Mm-hmm. She's just in this crazy situation and finally starts to put some of the pieces together. Mm-hmm. So I really found her character powerfully sympathetic, despite having everything in her life, including some of her own choices, stacked against her. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, the standout performance of a lot of good performances, including all the leads.
Mm-hmm. Another point of comparison to look at here is, I think in Tea and Sympathy, with the exception of Ellie, everyone we're looking at is kind of the same social class and is fairly upper class. Mm-hmm. I initially had been thinking, are the housemasters and their wives of actually a lower economic class than the students? But Bill says he is currently the housemaster of the house that he stayed in when he was a student here.
Yeah,
so he also went to school here.
Yeah.
So everyone's fairly snobby New England people in this film. Whereas the Children's Hour, it seems like the students and their families are a lot richer than the teachers. The teachers have just gotten into the black. Their school has just started making money.
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
when we go to the grandmother's house, it's extremely fancy. And David was shocked by her wearing a veil just sort of in everyday life as part of her hat.
Oh, she's wearing a veil when she goes to visit them. I was
Yeah.
slightly confused about whether or not there had been a funeral or something, but I think it was just a style.
No, that's just the style.
Yeah, I mean, the Children's Hour is a drama about scandal and finance and money and stuff like that. And
and the fact that they lose their livelihood is the real threat in Act 2.
And I think again, but both films, including the Children's Hour, is really focused on best is the love triangle, and the ramifications end up affecting Audrey Hepburn's character's
Karen.
Fiance, and
Joe.
He's fired at his job because he's sort of defending and still being associated with these accused lesbians, and it is a personal drama beyond just the scandal and the social stuff, about these people in a really difficult situation who initially are partially just defending themselves against slander, because the fundamental accusations are always slanderous, but are also struggling to figure out what to do about this really difficult personal situation they found themselves in. And, I actually think the Children's Hour to me would be most interesting if it was remade in the current year about the current year. I would really like to see what this story would be like if it was set in a time where homophobia was not the biggest problem, or it was not a major social concern or something that people were always necessarily hesitant about. If potentially similar accusations were made about these abhorrent or inappropriate sexual activity around children or whatever being made, and a story where that accusation is false, but these two women one of them does realize he has feelings for her friend who is engaged, and they have to figure out how to navigate that scandal with these new feelings in a modern time. I think that would be a really interesting story. Besides the fact that, oh wow, there are lesbians and we're talking about it.
Well, one thing that I'm not sure you could translate, and which I think is actually a really it's the secretly most pro-gay element of the film, which they have to keep quite subtle, is that Martha didn't actually get that she was a lesbian until she was accused of being one. And it's during the libel trial that she's like, oh, all these things that they're saying that, we feel for each other, which we're defending ourselves and saying we don't feel, I actually do feel those things. So it's at that point, at least, it's kind of a good thing for Martha. I think in the modern day, we would read this as a good thing for Martha, that she has discovered who she is. And all of these people who are trying to ruin their lives are actually helping them.
Yes.
And if you have Martha not kill herself, but instead go off with Karen and live happily ever after, then it's just like a fully, we got you, the straights.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so at the end of the Children's Hour, are Karen and her fiance still together, or have they broken up?
Karen told him to leave and not come back. He didn't really want to. We do see Joe at Martha's funeral.
Right.
But she's walking away from him.
Yeah, it's not clear, but...
Yeah, and the last shot is a close-up of Audrey Hepburn sort of walking kind of at peace away from the situation. And I think we're meant to understand that, like, she didn't... we didn't solve this problem with a heterosexual union.
That's right.
Which is what a lot of even modern productions would do.
Yeah. I mean, I could see an interesting story where they don't end up together. I could see an interesting story where they do end up together. I could see an interesting story where Karen and her fiance stay together and Shirley MacLaine goes off and makes her own new life. I think that's just an interesting story about interesting people. And I think it pairs really well with the scandal. And it's also really interesting as a sort of initial step to try to have an open discussion about homosexuality. But it's also just an interesting story about interesting people and interesting challenges. And I thought, the movie is not just advocacy.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap it up now. We are not going to give a star rating or anything like that, or even, I think, say which one is better. Although I maybe said that, which one I think is better earlier in the episode. That's not really the spirit of what we're doing. We're trying to do an academic project here, everyone. So we're just going to wrap up by answering the question of, did we watch these in the right order? Should you, if you want to do your own double feature, should you go Children's Hour and then Tea and Sympathy? Or should you go the other way around? Now, I had actually already seen both of these films and proposed them to David, and I recommended that we watch them in this order. So do you think that was the correct move?
I do probably think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Tea and Sympathy is a more forward-looking story.
Mm-hmm.
It's more forward-looking aesthetically, and it's also maybe a bit more involved.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a more involved story. So I think the Children's Hour is more thematic,
Mm-hmm.
and I think, maybe I'd want to watch that when I had a bit more energy. If I was going to watch them in a row, I definitely want to watch Children's Hour first,
Mm-hmm.
and then sort of sit back and be able to sort of enjoy Tea and Sympathy more for
Mm-hmm.
the dialogue and the story that unfolds.
Mm-hmm. I also think if this is something that matters to you, Tea and Sympathy, especially if you ignore the what we consider not canon framing device, has a happy ending, whereas Children's Hour has a sad ending. And so if you want to end on a happy note, David is giving me a skeptical look, but that's what my mom would want. So, Mom, if you're listening.
Yeah, no, I agree. I do agree that I think that I don't know exactly when the canon ending or whatever of the Children's Hour is either.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not exactly sure how to interpret it. But I agree that Tea and Sympathy is an empowering movie about making choices in life, and the Children's Hour is about just how difficult it is to actually find space to be yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think probably the Children's Hour is better at sort of setting up the issue,
mm-hmm.
and Tea and Sympathy is a little bit better to give you a feeling and some ideas moving forward about
mm-hmm.
the issue. It's maybe how I think about it, if you want to put it academically.
I also really do feel like, from a film history perspective, even though Children's Hour was made later, it is artistically an earlier film than Tea and Sympathy. So if you like going in chronological order based on vibes, that's the order.
Yeah. There's so much great stuff to talk about in these movies. In the Children's Hour, one scene that I found really striking, looking back on it, was late in the movie, the aunt of one of the two main characters who had been working at the school, she's a theater actress.
Mm-hmm. And she was the one who initially accused Shirley MacLaine's character of having an unnatural feeling towards Karen. So this is technically all her fault.
Yeah. And so there's this scene where Audrey Hepburn and Shirley MacLaine sort of confront her about all
mm-hmm.
the damage that she ended up doing to them. And I found this to be a really interesting parallel scene for sort of modern liberals, so to speak, who aren't always that eager to actually be helpful
mm-hmm.
to homosexual and gay people and their issues. And I thought that the aunt was sort of a really interesting stand-in for this sort of half-hearted liberalism. And she's
mm-hmm.
sort of this character saying, well, I never actually said that what you're doing was bad. I didn't actually help these people attack you. It was just kind of a lot of trouble for me, so I just wanted to kind of stay back, and
mm-hmm.
I'll be your friend now, that it doesn't actually end up hurting me.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want you to be mad at me, but I'm not going to end up helping you in any way. And so it's sort of this story about how, even though we think we're living in a progressive society and that we have people around us who will protect us, when the going gets tough, not everyone's really going to have your back.
Mm-hmm.
And so Tea and Sympathy is, again, a much more forward-looking story. And it's sort of about how, the world is changing.
Mm-hmm.
And, no one really minds that this person is maybe more gay and more effeminate. And everyone's kind of unhappy that they have to bully him. And, in that scene in the Children's Hour, they say, maybe one day there will be a world where people don't mind all of this stuff so much,
mm-hmm.
but today isn't that day.
Mm-hmm.
And Tea and Sympathy is sort of like, well, maybe today is that day.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. So, it's more forward-looking, and it's more positive. So that's how I'd want to end.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up there. I want to say thank you to Lillian Hellman and Robert Anderson for writing these plays initially. That probably made your lives meaningfully harder,
mm-hmm.
but good job, you guys.
Appreciated.
Okay, so we're coming to you now with slightly better audio quality, God, I hope, from the future to say that we did make a second episode of Double Feature Reviews. We got a Blue Yeti mic, so thank you for bearing with us for the first episode's bad audio. And the next series is going to be about murder mysteries, which I know people are especially sensitive to spoilers for, so we wanted to tell you what they were so that you would have time to watch them before the next episode comes out. David, what are we watching for episode 2?
We will be watching Gosford Park, directed by Robert Altman, and Knives Out, directed by Ryan Johnson.